tend to feel that that's an extension off the Templars based off of the skull and bones that they used to fly on their flag while they were in wartime? Is there a connection?
Well, no doubt they were an extension of the Templars and also an extension of the Bavarian Illuminati. The Skull and Bones initiation, according to Victoria Robbins, is that during that initiation, each one of them has to kiss the slippered toe of the Pope. And they are pronounced Knights of Eulogia, which means Eucharist. They're pronounced Knights of Eulogia after the initiation. So they're the ones that pronounces them that is Don Quixote. Well, if you read Cervantes' work, you'll see that it's a satire in the Jesuit order that Don Quixote is really nothing more than Ignatius Loyola, because he wants to send off Jerusalem and take Jerusalem from the Muslims, which is exactly what Loyola sought to do. So the Don Quixote and the Bones initiation is the Jesuit general. They're kissing the slippered toe of the Pope. All shows that their loyalty lies completely with the Vatican.
Speaking of Jews and Muslims again, my question is, and I've looked high and low, and I can't seem to find a connection. Theodore Herzl, most people call him the godfather of modern political Zionism, 1896. Was there a Jesuit and a Knight of Malta connection with him?
Yes. The reason Theodore Herzl started his Zionist movement, his labor Zionist movement, because remember the labor Zionists have killed off all the revisionist Zionists.
Right.
They killed them off because the revisionist Zionists were true Jews who wanted to have their own nation. And so they killed off the lone wolf, Jabotinsky, and all the other followers. But the Jesuits' labor Zionist movement was started by Theodore Herzl because of the Dreyfus Affair. If there was no Dreyfus Affair, there is no labor Zionist movement. And the Jesuits were behind the Dreyfus Affair. They were the ones that controlled Esterhazy, who was the real traitor, and they blamed Captain Alfred Dreyfus for passing French military secrets to the Germans, which was all a lie. They imprisoned him for, some 8 or 10 years at Devil's Island, and ultimately he was released and vindicated. But the Jesuits were behind this. The Assumptionists, which is nothing more than a continuation of the Jesuit order. They controlled the press in Paris, and they're the ones that were hyping it with all the Jews, the Jews, the Jews. Meanwhile, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion had been completed in France, written by the Jesuits, so that they could blame ultimately the Bolshevik Revolution on the Jews.
Right.
So it was an anti-Jewish movement in France set in motion by the Jesuits, because the Jesuits had been expelled from France by Gambetta in 1880, and so they had a score to settle with the French government, and they then excited this, and then as a result of this, Theodore Herzl, who's in cahoots with the Jesuits by way of the Rothschilds, he goes to visit the Pope, and he has an audience with the Pope in 1904. Now, anybody that has an audience with a pope is a traitor to his own people. That includes Martin Lucifer King. That includes Yasser Arafat. That includes Ronald Reagan. All of them, when they go kowtow to the pope, they're betraying their own nation and their own people. Theodore Herzl did that in 1904.
You mentioned Martin Luther King, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I understand that he was also a member of the Brotherhood. He was a high-level Mason.
I believe he was. There is nothing, I have no documentation where I can prove it, but I believe he was, because he is overseen by A. Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph was the black mover and shaker of the Jesuit Order's civil rights movement. And the man who controlled A. Philip Randolph was the Jesuit John Lafarge. John Lafarge was really the master in the beginning of the civil rights movement, not for the benefit of the blacks or the whites, but for the benefit of the Jesuit order. And John Lafarge was the right-hand advisor of Spellman, and he was the one responsible for getting Spellman in the NAACP, which was financed by Rockefeller. Right. So the Jesuits controlled A. Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph controlled King. When King became disobedient by calling for an end of Cardinal Spellman's war in Vietnam, that's when they killed him.
Correct. And I understand the Black Secret Society is called the Bole. Have you heard that?
The Bole Society. I have it on my website. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Why was Malcolm X murdered?
Malcolm X was murdered because he was a real man and because he told the truth when he found out that the Ku Klux Klan and the Nation of Islam have the same paymasters.
Right.
And when he said that publicly, that was the beginning of the end for him. Then
Farrakhan facilitated it, no?
That's correct. Farrakhan had a hand in the assassination for which he recently apologized to Malcolm X's daughter publicly on TV. So, I mean, he didn't come out and say he did it because, murder, there's no statute of limitations. He could be tried for that. But he came out and said, if I had anything to do with it, please forgive me. He knows very well he had a part in it, just like Wallace, the son of Elijah, the false prophet. So, and furthermore, Malcolm X then got on this Freemasonry about the Masons controlling the Nation of Islam. Because he knew the Ku Klux Klan was Masonic. The Ku Klux Klan used to attend NOI meetings. And that made Malcolm angry because his father was killed by Ku Klux Klansmen.
Right.
So when he saw the absolute duplicity of Elijah Muhammad, the false prophet, the dishonorable Elijah Muhammad, he quit and he came out and told the truth. Wallace Muhammad told Malcolm that Elijah Muhammad had fathered 8 girls from 4 young teenage black girls, and when he made this public, that did it for him. So you have the Nation of Islam furious with him, that's run by the FBI informant, the Freemason Elijah Muhammad, and also his son Wallace. You have the FBI mad at Malcolm X because the third in command of the FBI was Cartha DeLoach, who was a Knight of Malta, and he still lives, by the way. And you have
and Hoover hated him too, right? And Hoover was a Knight of Malta.
Hoover was a 33rd degree Freemason. Some sources say a Knight of Malta. He could very well be, but I know he was a 33rd degree Freemason. And he was also sitting on the Order of the 33rd degree in Washington, D.C. So Hoover was in on it too. So what happened was, and I tell this in my book, is that when it came the time to shoot Malcolm at Audubon Ballroom, the New York police was controlled by Spellman.
Right.
So they stood down. They didn't protect him. The FBI and the Nation of Islam worked together, according to Betty, Malcolm's wife. So they all worked together to murder Malcolm X, covered it up, never did a thorough investigation on that, and then blamed it on the Nation of Islam entirely.
I have a question regarding another assassination that occurred recently, last year, at the end of the year, Benazir Bhutto. Was there any Jesuit connection to her?
Oh, sure. Benazir Bhutto was supposed to give information to Arlen Specter.
The Masonic Jew that was involved with Kennedy's assassination.
That's right. 33rd degree Jewish Freemason, still a senator of my state, in the name of Christ. So he was involved, and then Benazir Bhutto said that bin Laden had been killed several years ago by the man who was threatening her life. Well,
she did it on the interview with Frost. I saw that.
Right, with Frost. So we can't let that out of the basket, can we? We have to keep this fraud that we're after bin Laden alive to justify this papal crusade. So she did 2 things. She was going to be very effectual in not bringing Pakistan into this crusade to truly go after any Muslims that were involved in quote-unquote al-Qaeda. And so she was a threat to the power of the Jesuit order in continuing this crusade. So they killed her. And of course it was the Pakistani ISI that oversaw it all.
Right, and the ISI takes their orders from the CIA, and the CIA takes their orders from the Jesuit order.
That's right. And Teilhard de Chardin was a foremost Jesuit in the 1950s and late 1940s who was working for the Office of Naval Intelligence as well as the CIA. Under Knight of Malta, Wild Bill Donovan, who had John Birch murdered by Mao Zedong so they could put Mao Zedong in office as the chief inquisitor in China.
I like for you to make it clear to all the listeners, because there's only 2 perspectives that we get on 9/11, that the U.S. government did it or the Israeli government did it. But I know you mentioned in your book that Kolvenbach was the one that ordered the attack. Could you explain to the listeners what the Jesuits' connection to 9/11